Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Financial Clarity for Doctors. This is Rachelle Vanderzanden here with Corey.
Hello.
Hello. And today we're going to talk about some taboo money topics and the taboo nature of money in general. It's just one of these weird things that we don't talk about very much when actually it's really important for most people. So we wanted to talk a little bit about why it's still kind of a no-no to talk about it and when and where it's something that we don't usually talk about. Why is that? And maybe some ways that we can potentially change that. So I think, to start, just the why of it, I think it's one of those things where when we think about social structure and what we're allowed to talk about and what we're not allowed to talk about, there's not a whole lot of objective reasons for why that is. It's just something that people decided at one point. It's like, this is something we don't talk about because, and then you try to insert a good reason, and there is no good reason. I firmly believe that with money. Like, there's not really a good objective reason to not talk about money, other than maybe like, let's not hurt people's feelings. But that just goes with, maybe you need to be careful about how you talk about things. It's not the thing itself that's offensive at all. Like, money is not an offensive thing. So I think it varies by culture too. Like, obviously, we're talking about the culture here where we grew up. And, that's generally been the way that we were raised. Like, we don't really talk about how much money we make. We don't really talk about all these different things. But it's really interesting for Corey and I because we are in this industry where all we do is talk about money all day, every day. And so within, affinity group, within financial advising, we're all very comfortable talking about all things money. And I do think that sometimes in my personal life, I forget that other people are not comfortable talking about money. So there's been lots of situations where I just start talking about money things without any sort of filter. And I have a moment where I wonder if I'm making other people uncomfortable. And I still don't feel uncomfortable at all. But you do realize, like, okay, maybe this isn't something that other people want to talk about or, feel as comfortable talking about. So, we're going to dive into a few of those topics and situations where people may or may not be comfortable, but also just some of the reasons behind this.
Yeah, I think one belief is maybe you want to call it a fallacy that money or wealth equals human value. And the more you have, the more you earn, the more important you are. And it establishes that social pecking order, which, right or wrong, there is some truth to that in the sense of how we view others. It's like, all right, rich, famous, powerful, maybe not the famous part, but if you have money, you got power in our society, more things, more doors are open for you. But I don't think it's fair to equate it with someone's worth or value. There's a lot of people that don't earn a lot or don't have a lot that make a huge impact in their communities and the world and the people around them. So it's kind of unfair that money has such that strong stigma. Um, and as a result, it can talking about money, especially if there's a discrepancy between you and the person you're talking with, whether they have more or you have more, it can result in a feeling of shame or embarrassment. And, there's that fear of judgment if talking about money, like Rachelle mentioned. We feel very comfortable talking about it, and even in social settings where the other people may not be as comfortable. And I think for others, there is that fear of being judged, and I'm sure it varies from person to person. Um, and I guess our society has dictated that money is personal information. What you have is personal information, and then your personal info should be kept private and not shared. So that probably has something to do with it. Could also be seen as crass when you talk about money, but I don't know. I think we try hard to change that stigma, and I think over time, I think it slowly is becoming a little more comfortable for some, especially in younger generations that share everything on social media. Um, I think it is becoming a little bit more commonplace, but still definitely a taboo subject.
Yeah. I think the social media thing is interesting too, because I do think that people project more wealth and resources than they actually have a lot. So in some ways, it may be creating more transparency and like creating more ways to talk about things. But in other ways, I think it's just another way to front, another way to like, put yourself out there as being able to do whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it. And that's not the reality for most people.
For sure. I guess there's some that, yeah, they're just putting on their, filtered life on Instagram or TikTok or wherever, and look at me, look at what I have, show off, flaunt, etc. But then there are others that, like, I say maybe more specifically, financial personas or bloggers or personalities that, like, they'll publish their quarterly net worth on Instagram. They'll, take snapshots of their 401k balance and things of that nature, which, I don't know how I feel about. I think on the positive side, it's good that they're being open and trying to create more openness and comfort around talking about money. Same time, do you need to share your 401k balance? Because again, it could make others feel uncomfortable. So
Yeah,
it is a balancing act of trying to push forward and get rid of the taboo nature around money while also not harming or hurting other people's feelings.
right. And I think when we talk about like there needs to be more transparency with finances and things like that, it's really about like a lack of financial education in our society. And if we are unfamiliar with something and we are uncomfortable talking about it, then we may not really understand it. And that can create some big disadvantages. So it's not necessarily like you need to talk with your family about exactly how much you have in your 401k. It's more, are you willing to talk about a 401k? Are you willing to talk about retirement savings in general? Like those are things that can be very valuable to discuss. And there's lots of people, people grow up and they go to church every Sunday and you go to Sunday school and your kids grow up learning about religion and they go into the world having this knowledge about religion. What if we created things like that for other useful skills as well? Like finances. Like I don't know that we can necessarily completely rely on, the education system to teach about how to manage personal finances because there's a lot of things that they're required to teach and there's all the standardized testing and like financial literacy just doesn't fit nicely into a standardized testing box. It's not there yet. So I think that it's something that we have to take on as families and as a society just to help kids learn about this so that they can make good choices moving forward.
Yeah. And yeah, I think it would be tough. We could talk about more later, but to implement some sort of financial education curriculum because it's such a vast topic and there's so many it applies differently to people,
Mm-hmm.
case by case. Like for doctors, for example, student loans, public service loan forgiveness, big subject matter. For a lot of the rest of society, not nearly as big of a subject matter. They didn't take out $200,000 of loans to go to med school. Now, maybe, plenty of people have undergrad student loans and there's scenarios where it applies to them, but, totally different set of circumstances. So certain specific subjects around money apply to certain groups but not others, so it's hard to just do a blanket. Here's the generalized education you should have. I think there are certain things like how does a credit card work? What is interest? And do you pay it? Do you receive it, etc.? The importance of saving for retirement. Look at some of those compound interest tables. Talk a bit about generalized investing. So there is a lot of stuff that could be implemented, but I don't think high school is necessarily the appropriate time for all of that because it's just not relevant then. You don't.
Mm-hmm. You
So,
forget half of it by the time that it is, or
mhm.
three-quarters of it, or 90% of it.
But at least bringing it up and
Yeah,
having that exposure, I think, is beneficial. Because, like, if you're
absolutely.
a 6-year-old in Sunday school, you don't understand or know what the heck most of this stuff is. If we're going back to that analogy, but just having that continuous drip, drip, drip exposure to it, you slowly start to grasp, slowly start to remember concepts, and and it'll, ultimately be a more familiar subject for you when it becomes more applicable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a handful of financial topics that are particularly taboo, and we're gonna walk through a few of those. I think the big one that I always think about is salaries, how much you're compensated. Um, with colleagues, like discussing that with colleagues, there's a lot of workplace environments where it's still like not okay and not allowed to discuss your salary with your colleagues. And I think, people outside of your workplace, they're even less likely to talk about exactly how much you get paid. But it's silly, coworkers honestly should discuss their salaries because and with other peers in their same industry to get an understanding of how they are being compensated compared to peers. Because if you don't know that, you don't know if you're underpaid, you don't know if you're getting paid fairly. And I think that employers often use that as a way to undercompensate people that do not advocate for themselves. And I think that this can be true in medicine, especially because, when you start at a new job, there are lots of jobs where you can negotiate your salary, you can negotiate a starting bonus, all of these things, and not everyone does this. And I think a lot of times it kind of leans more heavily towards, maybe women don't advocate for themselves and they don't negotiate as much and things like that. So you get this not level playing field from the very beginning when you're starting in practice that just gets, worse over time as you go through your career. But if people talked about what they got paid and if they knew that they were getting paid less than their colleagues with similar experience and things like that, it would be much harder for employers to justify doing that in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just being more open, transparent, creates that understanding, and it ultimately will be normal then. If everyone knows what everyone else is making, it's the norm. It does create much more of a level playing field. Some of it is, though, market driven. Like if you're a primary care doc in San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York, you're a dime a dozen. So there's only so much negotiating up you can do before they could find someone else to do the same job at a lower cost. Whereas if you want to make more money, North Dakota's calling. They could use a primary care doc because there's not one in a 300-mile radius in some small town, and they could use you and pay you 400 grand a year plus give you an extra 50 a year to go to your student loans. So, like any industry, the market does dictate the compensation. Um, let's see, another one. Debt is a somewhat taboo subject. Having debt, being in debt, no one wants to care to admit that. Although certain debts can be very useful and helpful to you. Like if you're starting a business, you might need to take out a loan to get things off the ground. If you want to buy a house, you probably need to take out a mortgage to get that house. I think taking out a mortgage is very much more normal and acceptable, an acceptable form of debt, but how much mortgage you take out is maybe a little taboo. But like, for example, right now, if you have a 3% interest rate mortgage, but you're paying 3% in interest, but you can receive 4% or more on your high interest savings account or 5% on a short-term treasury bill, there's really no point paying extra on that mortgage because you're making more money by putting your excess money to use in other areas. I'm sure you can invest it and no guarantees, but likely get more than 3% on average over the long run. So that having that low interest rate debt can really help you accelerate your path towards financial independence and achieving your other financial goals by using that excess money more productively. Credit cards, those are just brutal. If you have credit card debt, you probably don't want to talk about it at all. But you might be able to get some insight or some ideas from others. Maybe there's a 0% interest option you could do a balance transfer to. Maybe there's a credit card out there that gives you better points. I think the points and rewards is more comfortable for people to discuss. Um, but
Yeah, I actually had a personal family friend reach out to me about a situation that they were dealing with. And it was because, like the week before, we'd been talking about money stuff. And she never would have reached out and asked me about that if we hadn't already been having some fairly frank conversations about money. But it was basically like, hey, we need a new HVAC. We also need a new car. I don't know exactly, like, should we like empty our savings? Should we finance it? If we do finance it, how should we finance it? She was asking me all of these very relevant questions that I think 2 weeks before she would never have felt comfortable asking me. And I was able to give her some helpful information. And even if you don't like have a financial advisor friend, you likely have someone who's been through a similar situation and done some research, and even if they can't, maybe you don't trust their exact answer, but they might give you some information, and then you look at the internet to like, help you get on the right track and figure it out. And we were able to come up with some really helpful solutions for that particular problem. And that's the kind of thing that can be really good about talking about money, is that you can come across some good ideas to help you deal with, unexpected issues involving debt more efficiently.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. Another one that's probably a bit taboo to bring up is inheritance. I
Or
don't think,
trust funds.
yeah, no one really cares to admit if they received an inheritance or a trust fund baby. Um, it can lead to strife within family members, especially if the inheritance wasn't distributed equally, or even if it was distributed equally, but certain individuals feel they should have received a larger share, maybe because they helped out more with ailing parents. Um, or maybe they made less money than their siblings during their career, so they feel like they should, get a larger share of the inheritance to try and even things out. But um, again, I think if it's just something that's more openly discussed and talked about, it becomes a little more comfortable and maybe can create some less strife, um, within family members, or hopefully maybe removing somewhat of that aspect of envy and judgment across our culture. So,
Yeah. When there are inheritances and things like that, when, the person that is gifting that money, when they pass away, if they've been fairly open about it ahead of time, there's not going to be as many arguments. Like it's just so much better if you know what to expect. Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. I think on the house side of things, kind of related to debt, but like, if you bought a house, the price of your house, the cool thing is that that's public information now. So,
Anyone with
you
your
know,
address can look up what you paid.
exactly. And honestly, I will tell you as a financial professional, that's one of the first things I do, which is probably terrible to admit, but that's like, you deal with money every day. You're very curious about like, what is this house? Like what's going on with this house? And I think that that's really interesting. Like people don't necessarily want to tell you what they may have paid for a house. They may be embarrassed thinking they overpaid or something like that. Also, like the cost of home renovations. I think a lot of people experience sticker shock when they're looking at doing home renovations because people don't talk about it openly when they pay for it. Like no one wants to tell you they paid 60 grand for their kitchen remodel, but maybe they did. And a lot of times they did. And I think that it could be really helpful to have some of that information ahead of time just to, do you really want to do that? Obviously, you're going to get quotes before you go through with it, but by the time you're getting quotes, maybe you've already decided you want to do it. So even if it's a higher price than expected, you may just roll with it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's see. Gift giving, this one might be more of like a pet peeve, but the price of a gift, either like we don't tell people how much we spent on their gift, even though it's pretty easy to look up on Amazon what it costs. But I mean, the stigma behind it, either you overspent and they feel guilty that you spent so much on them, or you come off as cheap because you didn't spend enough. And where's that line? Like who's in charge of setting the price of how much you should spend on a birthday present, a wedding present, kids, nephew, like how far out does the family tree go before you stop sending gifts? So I don't know. Like I'm of the mindset you're a grown up, buy your own stuff. Gifts should stop at age 18. But
I totally agree. I think that gifts are overdone in general. Like it's just one of those things where half the time you give people something they don't really want just because you feel like you have to give them something. And it's especially with adults. Most of the time, adults have resources to get their own things. I've kind of resorted to like if there's someone that I really care about and I want to give them a gift, I think about the last thing that they gave me. And honestly, a lot of times when people give gifts, it's something that they know that they would enjoy. And so they give that to you knowing, hey, I would enjoy this. I bet she'll enjoy it too. but that's really what they like. So, you can kind of figure things out that way a little bit, but it's challenging. I think that's one of those things that socially maybe we should talk about a little bit more. Like, do we really even want to do this anymore? Is this worth the time and effort and emotional stress that we put on ourselves to give gifts when really, like, the other person may not care at all whether you get them a present? I think a lot of times that's the case.
Yeah,
And
like
it feels awkward to ask, like, do you even want a present?
my brothers and I have just agreed, like we've stopped giving each other gifts. It's like, why
Yep.
exchange $50 Amazon gift cards for the holidays when we could just not do that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every once in a while though, like if we see something that we know they'll like, like, oh, I found this, beer or bottle of bourbon that I know you like, and it's hard to come by, like snagged it for you,
Those
type of
are so
thing.
much
Or
more genuine and like heartfelt gifts
yeah,
too. And there's no like time limit on it, It's just, yeah,
or
I'm
like
all about it.
if we're invited to a dinner party or something, sure, bring a bottle of wine or whatever they're into. But like if I'm hosting, I don't expect people to bring me anything. Like I'll just tell people, hey, here's what I got. If you want something different, bring it yourself. But please don't bring anything uh, for me to have because, like, again, I'm a grown up. I'll buy my own stuff. But I guess
Yeah,
I'm in a position to do that. Not everyone necessarily is. So gets back to
it's
that
true.
socioeconomic area where some people might be uncomfortable if they're invited to a dinner party and they don't feel they have the means to bring a bottle of wine or a gift for hosting, and they politely decline the invitation because they'd be embarrassed.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah. I
Seems
think some of this, you can't just talk yourself out of. Some of it is going to be challenging. And I think that's true of any social circumstance, obviously. One other thing that I think people may be hesitant to talk about, not everyone, but financial advice, just the fact that you pay an advisor. I think there are some people that are really excited about it and they talk to everyone about it. And those are where we get all our referrals from, people that are just like, this has been really helpful for me. But there are other people who may be embarrassed that they work with a financial advisor, either because they don't want to admit that they need help with money, or maybe they don't want to admit that they're in a position that they have money that justifies needing help, almost like, oh, this kind of makes it feel like I'm stuck up or snobby or something because I have a financial advisor. But I don't know. I think it's one of those things where if you have good advice from a financial advisor, maybe you want to talk about like that advice that you've received and whether or not it's going to be helpful for someone else as well. But yeah, it's kind of a weird thing that sometimes comes up for folks.
next one here is interesting because some people are totally cool with it, others are not or embarrassed by it. But like money spent on luxury items. Some view it as a status symbol, a way to show off, hey, look, I made it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, good for you. If that's, makes you feel better, kudos to you. Others are more uncomfortable and embarrassed by flaunting wealth, the whole stealth wealth, thing. Keep your money under the radar. Like for me personally, and this is just me, I don't care, how you feel, but I am not a car person. A car for me is just get me from point A to point B safely and, reliably. Don't want to do maintenance, don't want to, you know, have to get a new car every few years. And like personally, I'd be embarrassed driving a luxury car. I'd be embarrassed to wear a Rolex watch. Could I go buy a Rolex watch? Sure, maybe some of the lower end ones. Um, but like I would just feel like an a-hole walking around with one. That being said, I know people that collect watches, and like having a nice Rolex, like that's awesome. Good for you if you're into that. If you're into cars and you feel good about, buying and driving a nice car, good for you. It's, kind of the Ramit Sethi thing, spend money on what brings you joy. If that brings you joy, fantastic. But, don't spend money on other stuff that doesn't bring you joy. So for me, not into the material things, but I will spend a lot of money on liquor. Like I don't drink a ton, but like I've bought in $200, $300 bottles of whiskey or tequila before. Um, you know, that's like enjoy that. It's not, some people don't. If you don't drink, that's probably not appealing to you. But like for me, I'm doing the math in my head. All right, I could buy $100,000 car, or I could buy like 500 bottles of really, really high end stuff. And, say if there's like 12 to 16 drinks per 750 milliliter bottle, like for the cost of that car, I could get 6,000 to 8,000 glasses of whiskey out of this, which would last me like 20 years of having a drink every single day. Like that, so for me, that's, I feel like money better spent for something I enjoy. Whereas, the car, it maybe last 10 years and it only, I'd have to spend maintenance costs on it and et cetera. So anyway, spend money on what brings you joy. If you like material things, great. Spend money on that. If you don't spend money on that. Find things that but I think for some, getting back to that, the shame, embarrassment and stuff, like it's a real thing. People aren't, maybe not care to admit how much they've spent on certain things.
Yeah.
Um,
I love that for both of us, it's alcohol. Because I think for me, like the thing that we spend a stupid amount of money on is probably wine. Like, because I really like a good glass of
that's
wine.
great.
But
Buy $100 bottle of wine if you want, if you
yeah,
really like it.
on the flip side of things, I think there are some people that maybe get a lot of money to like, causes that are near and dear to their heart. And, they may feel comfortable talking about those causes, but they may not feel comfortable talking about like the extent of their giving, which it's fine. I think that's fine to like, you know, want to keep exact numbers to yourself, just like we were talking about earlier. But people should absolutely feel comfortable talking about supporting those causes themselves, because if that's really important to you, that may be something that someone else would want to contribute to as well. So it can be really, it's not like it's stuck up to do charitable giving. I think that's something that people should absolutely feel comfortable talking about.
For
Yeah.
sure. Um, let's see. The you know, the social stigma, being uncomfortable with wealth or around wealth, it's that stigma that money equals power or importance. I'm better than you because I have more type of thing. Which I think is where, some people are comfortable talking about money within people of similar socioeconomic status. Like, Rachelle and I, zero qualms talk about money. Part of that's due to our vocations, but part of it we're also on a level playing field where we have pretty much the exact same opportunities within our careers. So it's more comfortable that way. Like I feel very comfortable, outside of my workplace talking with people about money who I feel are on a similar playing field or even higher up on that socioeconomic ladder than me. But I would feel uncomfortable talking openly about it with people that I know probably don't have the same means as me. Like, I'm okay with punching up, but I don't want to punch down. I'd feel like I don't want to come across as I'm better than someone. So like, totally cool talking money with fellow financial advisors, doctors, other people that seem to have um, some means, but might feel awkward discussing it with the school teacher parents of my kid's soccer team, just because I know they're maybe not in the same position uh, financially as others. So I don't know. Maybe that's a personal issue, but I think that applies to a lot of people too. They don't want to make others feel uncomfortable, especially if they have the means. And then vice versa, if you don't have those same means, you don't want to feel embarrassed or shameful because you're not in the same position.
Yeah. There's a time and a place for everything, I think. It's helpful to be discreet. We're like, ooh, talk about money. But it can be helpful to be discreet if you feel like it's going to be uncomfortable. Like, or, introduce it in very small ways that just don't rock the boat a little bit. But, in general, I think the big question is here is like, can we change the taboo nature of talking about money? And I think so. Like, social norms change all the time. And you can see so many examples of that throughout history, like bathing suits in the 50s compared to today, or just clothing in general, especially for women. like what people were expected to wear in the 50s versus what people wear now. Like our parents, our grandparents, when we got dead wearing what you see at the beach or the pool today. And I don't think there's any like value judgment there. I think it's just something that changes over time. Like it just is what it is. And that's fine. I think mental health is another really good example. Like people didn't talk about that stuff at all, like decades ago. And I think it's still a little bit taboo. Like we sweep it under the rug, but it's much more acceptable to say, hey, I go to counseling. I see a psychiatrist, I see a therapist, like that. And I think that it's a way for people to normalize that a little bit. And this is the same sort of thing where, the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it and allow people to get the help that they need if they do need assistance. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great examples. Talking about just talking about it more generally and in a positive light. Like if you like the mental health one, you know, I go to a therapist, I go to a counselor, etc. You don't have to talk about the specific things you're going for or that you're addressing with said therapist or counselor or psychiatrist, but at least breaking down that stigma that you're weak if you seek help for mental health. That I think that's a huge one that's changed for the better. But still, share what you're comfortable with, but keep the part that you're uncomfortable with private. Nothing wrong with that. And relaying to money, talking more about it openly and in a positive light. A lot of the discussions around money in our culture associate money negatively. Um, and th if that continues, it's just going to be very difficult to make it more comfortable to talk about. So if we
Yeah.
talk about it in a more positive manner, I think that'll help, you know, make people more comfortable. And then also
Yeah.
just creating more educational opportunities with money. We kind of talked earlier about it, introducing it in school, etc. How do you do that? I don't know. Like who's even qualified to be teaching it, is another question. But at least it breaks the ice and starts to normalize it. And within your families, talk about money with your kids. You don't have to tell them exactly how much you have in your checking account or your 401k, but at least talk about the importance of saving for retirement. Talk about the importance of paying off your credit cards each month, and why we can't spend money on this thing because we're prioritizing that thing instead because it's more important to us. Um, for
We've
whatever
talked
reason
about this
that
a
may be.
little bit before, but I think talking to kids about how, you know, work equals money and then money equals like things or food and services and all of that kind of stuff. And like talking about the balance there, because sometimes, people assume I need to make more and more and more and more money. And sometimes that's not the answer and that may not be your priority. And I think it's cool to teach kids to think about it that way. Like, you work to really satisfy your needs, but also, the things that you really want and you really value. But then, how much do you value your time as well? But I also think that for young adults now, there's been a lot of emphasis on doing the thing that you want to do and, like finding, some sort of, I don't know, like self fulfillment through your work and things like that. And then people may be in a position where they can't even pay their rent because they're not willing to work a job that helps them pay their rent. So I think having like very frank discussions about those kinds of things with kids is important too. Like you need a baseline amount of money to pay your bills. And at some point, that will be on you, and I won't be able to do it for you anymore. And there's always going to be like a time and a place where it's appropriate to talk about this with kids. Like, at what age do we introduce this? At what age do we introduce this? And I think that will be something that maybe we talk about in another podcast episode. But obviously, I think that we don't talk about that enough in society today because I think you see a lot of younger adult children relying on parents for longer and longer and longer.
Yeah, some of it is discussing money, and some of it is just instilling that desire for independence and work ethic. And I don't know if there's a book that'll tell you the right way to do it, as any
No.
parents can relate. It varies from kid to kid, and the nature versus nurture. Like, as parents, we only have so much influence. on our children. Some of it's just dumb luck who they end up associating with, their friend group,
Yeah.
experiences they've had outside of the house. But we can, try our hardest to do everything we can inside the house to make it, a normalized topic. And I think I was very fortunate growing up because parents talked about money openly. They didn't talk about exactly how much we had, but like here's why we're clipping coupons because this is on sale at the grocery store and we want to spend less money on that thing so we can have more money to spend somewhere else. This is why we're doing this instead of that, saving for retirement, things of
Hmm.
that nature, like starting with an allowance and teaching your kids the importance of saving some of it. If you want to buy this thing, here's how much it costs. Here's how much your allowance is. Looks like you're gonna have to save up for a few months if you want to get that thing. So, you're kind of just gradually teaching that to uh, to your children and just talking about it more regularly to make them more comfortable with it. And then hopefully that'll help remove the taboo nature for generations to come.
Yeah. I think it's definitely harder to change, kind of ingrained expectations with adults than it is with kids. So start with your kids.
Yeah, kids are very comfortable talking about whatever is on their mind out in public, as anyone with young
Absolutely.
children knows. There's no filter. So
Yep.
maybe we need to, take a page out of our kids' book and start doing that as adults within
Within
reason.
reason.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening.
See you next time.